Welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever actually stopped to think about the absolute most critical, yet somehow frequently overlooked ingredient in the global restaurant industry? I'm not talking about artisan flour or fancy imported spices. I'm talking about water. Literally, behind every single plate of food, every sanitized glass, and every sparkling kitchen lies a massive dependency on a resource that is getting more scarce and more expensive by the minute. So today, we're going to explore the hidden financial costs and severe operational risks of water scarcity in the restaurant industry. And more importantly, we'll break down exactly how leading companies track and manage this risk using a very specific gold standard sustainability framework. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Restaurant Water Challenge. Then we'll be unpacking the SASB metric. After that, we're tracking water withdrawn, measuring water consumed, identifying baseline water stress, and finally wrapping up with the bottom line. All right, Section 1, the Restaurant Water Challenge and Industry Risk. Let me ask you, do you actually know your restaurant's true water footprint? And honestly, I don't just mean glancing at a monthly utility bill and paying it. Think about a bustling commercial kitchen for a second. The sheer volume of water used in cooking, those continuous dishwashing cycles, the heavy-duty cleaning, it exposes restaurants to severe risks, especially if they operate in water-stressed regions. With population growth, pollution, and climate change, supplies are getting squeezed and costs are climbing. This isn't just an environmental issue anymore. It's a fundamental business continuity issue. If the taps run dry or if water becomes prohibitively expensive, a restaurant simply cannot operate. Moving right along to Section 2, unpacking the SASB metric, FBR N140A.1. Now, to manage this risk, you first have to measure it accurately. Enter the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB. They provide a definitive structure for the food and beverage sector, specifically for restaurants. SASB, which is actually now part of the IFRS Foundation, creates these industry-specific standards that investors heavily rely on. We are zeroing in on one very specific code today, FBRN 140A.1. This metric is basically our definitive roadmap for water management. It tells us exactly what data points investors and operators need to truly understand a restaurant's water risk profile. Let's dive into Section 3, tracking water withdrawn across all sources. Okay, so the very first step in complying with the SASB standard is calculating exactly how much water is coming into your restaurant's operations. And the standard is super precise. This absolutely must be measured in thousands of cubic meters. But where is this water actually coming from? Well, you have to account for all sources. Yes, for a typical restaurant, the vast majority is going to come from municipal water supplies or standard utilities. But wait, if your facility draws from surface water like lakes or rivers, taps into groundwater, or maybe even utilizes systems for collected and stored rainwater, all of it counts towards your gross withdrawal. You have to capture the entire intake. And there is a really critical distinction to make here regarding the quality of that withdrawn water. Sometimes a restaurant might need to disclose portions of its supply by source, particularly if a big chunk comes from non-freshwater sources. So, how does SASB define freshwater? Well, if there isn't a specific local legal definition, freshwater is defined as water having less than 1,000 parts per million of dissolved solids. Practically speaking, though, if your water comes from a standard utility in compliance with regular drinking water regulations, you're good. It safely meets this definition of freshwater. Section 4. Measuring water consumed and looking at net operational usage. So the crucial point here is really understanding the difference between withdrawal and consumption. Let's think of it using a quick financial analogy. Water withdrawn is kind of like your gross revenue. It's absolutely everything you take in from all sources. Water consumed, on the other hand, is like your net. It's what is actually used up, lost, or embedded, and therefore no longer available to the local environment. SASB requires you to track both of these figures in thousands of cubic meters because they tell two totally different stories about your operational footprint. Let's make this abstract definition a bit more tangible for a restaurant setting. According to the standard, water consumption happens in three main ways. First up, evaporation. Think of boiling giant vats of pasta water or the water that evaporates from commercial cooling towers and HVAC systems. Second, water directly or indirectly included in the product. If you're serving soups, brewing coffee, or mixing fountain drinks, that water is leaving the restaurant in the customer's cup or stomach. And third, water that does not return to the same catchment area from which it was withdrawn. So if your wastewater is discharged out into the ocean rather than returning to the local freshwater basin, yep, it's considered consumed. Which brings us to Section 5, identifying baseline water stress and mapping geographical risks. You see, it's not just about how much water you use, it's about where you use it. Using 10,000 cubic meters of water in a rainy, water-rich region is a fundamentally different business risk than using that exact same amount in a desert experiencing a multi-year drought, right? SASB requires entities to map their operations against global geographical risks. To do this, you analyze your operations using a specific tool, the World Resources Institute's Water Risk Atlas, known as Aqueduct. You systematically identify which of your restaurant facilities sit in stressed zones, and then you calculate exactly what percentage of your total withdrawn and consumed water happens right there in those vulnerable locations. When you plug your locations into the WRI Aqueduct tool, you're looking for two specific thresholds of baseline water stress. A region is categorized as having high water stress if the baseline ratio of total water withdrawals to available renewable surface and groundwater supplies is between 40 and 80%. In other words, a huge portion of the available water is already being spoken for by human, agricultural, and industrial use. But the ultimate red zone is greater than 80%. Drill this number into your mind. If a region hits this threshold, it officially suffers from extremely high baseline water stress. If your restaurant operates heavily in these zones, you are absolutely on the front line for potential water usage restrictions, sudden utility price spikes, and severe supply chain constraints. This metric forces a company to reveal exactly what percentage of their water reliance is sitting directly in the crosshairs of this greater than 80% danger zone. Finally, Section 6, the bottom line and the financial imperative. So why go through all this rigorous tracking and thousands of cubic meters across complex global risk maps? Well, because tracking this SASB data directly ties back to your restaurant's profitability and resilience. By knowing your gross withdrawals, net consumption, and geographical vulnerabilities, you can strategically mitigate your exposure to local water usage restrictions before they even happen. You protect your margins against historically rising water costs. It forces management to actually address long-term supply constraints, and ultimately, it drives operational efficiency. Once you see the true cost and risk of your water footprint, investing in water-efficient commercial kitchen equipment and smarter operational practices isn't just an environmental choice, it becomes an absolutely obvious financial imperative. We have covered a lot of ground today, from unpacking SASB metric FBRN 148.1 to navigating the World Resources Institute's risk maps. So I'll leave you with this final vital question. Is your restaurant actually prepared to mitigate the rising costs and risks of tomorrow's water scarcity? Because if you aren't tracking your withdrawal and consumption against these baseline water stress levels, you might be flying blind right into an operational storm. Use these frameworks to evaluate your disclosures and secure your operations. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.